Welcome to the Nerd Party.
Let the filibustering begin.
Welcome to Nerd Party.
Hello and welcome to Filibuster here on the Nerd Party Network. I'm joined by the Jim Gordon to my emo Batman, Dallas King. Dallas, how are you?
I'm very well. Trying to grow the tash. It's not there yet, but hopefully by the next incarnation of Batman, it should be all right.
There's only one movie to talk about this week, and that's Colin Farrell's new film, After Yang. Oh, wait, no, that's the counter-programming movie to the Batman, which we'll be discussing later this week on the A24 project, and that is Matt Reeves' The Batman. So, Dallas, we come to it at last. We've been waiting for years and years for a new Batman movie. How were you feeling sort of about, before we even dive into the film, like, let's go back a good wee while. Like, they've announced that they're going to make a new Batman movie. It's going to be Ben Affleck. He's going to direct it. Then he pulls out, and then Matt Reeves comes in. Robert Pattinson comes in. Has it kind of got to that stage where you were just sitting there like, oh, did we need another Batman movie? Where were you sort of before all this kind of kicked off?
I mean, does anyone need another Batman movie? Probably not. I mean, he's probably sort of our generation's Hamlet, I guess, in that, no one ever really sort of criticizes the multiple incarnations of a Shakespearean adaptation, as long as it sort of meets the caveat of you maybe try and do something different with it. I mean, I was writing a review yesterday, furiously typing away once the film had finished because I had a couple of hours to meet the embargo, and I was thinking, this is our fifth or sixth actor taking on the cowl of the Dark Knight since Michael Keaton's in 1989. We had Keaton, Kilmer, Clooney, then Christian Bale, Affleck. One would also potentially count Will Arnett as Lego Batman.
So I think we've got to count him. He's one of the best Batman.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so yeah, Pattinson would be the seventh in 32 years. That's not including any of the animated movies, some of which are fantastic as well. So shout out to Kevin Conroy, who does the voice of Batman in those. So yeah, were we needing it? No. Probably what piqued my interest. I kind of was. I wasn't a huge fan of Batman and versus Superman or Justice League, but certainly the treatment of Ben Affleck's movie, which was essentially almost sounded like a bit of a sort of horror thriller, escape from Arkham sort of thing, that sounded interesting. Obviously, we sadly will never see that version, but yeah, I think it was certainly as a the proprietors of the A24 project, the casting of Robert Pattinson was certainly the thing that piqued my interest. Also, Matt Reeves has battled against the odds, I think, for a lot of his career. An English language remake of Let the Right One In, never work. Actually, the film's not bad. Turning a reboot of a franchise of Planet of the Apes into one of the most underrated and best film trilogies of all time. Well done him. So yeah, no, the talent behind and in front of the camera was enough for me to come to it with an open mind. And yeah, my thoughts will be delivered shortly. What about yourself?
I was on board with it, much like yourself. Like, I think I found the whole sort of from Man of Steel kind of all the way through this whole sort of Justice League era kind of series of movies really tiring, boring, uninteresting, and just the online discourse is just relentless about movies that I just genuinely don't think deserve half of the attention that they're getting. But when Matt Reeves came on board, it certainly piqued my interest. But yeah, it was the addition of Robert Pattinson for me and so on. I think you get to this stage sometimes where you get actors that you're particularly fond of, and you look at his sort of post-Twilight career, which we've kind of really dived into on this podcast and on the A24 podcast. I mean, he's constantly picking unique and new movies, anything that's really strayed away from kind of the blockbuster world. I mean, you can say Tenet is a big blockbuster movie and you'd be correct, but it's not quite that that type of movie. It's, you know, something original, and the idea of him getting involved with the Batman almost felt like a potential step back. And but you know, you can't argue with his casting. He's just a fantastic actor. And I remembered, you know, tweeting at the time, and I've just loaded it up here, like, there was people sort of like naturally complaining, oh, he's the emo, no, that sort of like, he's this terrible actor from Twilight, which always betrayed a lack of movie watching it in my eyes. And you know, you look at it where this was just at the time, but it could certainly be extended beyond that. And it was like, this was like on the 17th of May 2019, Robert Pattinson, who's worked with Christopher Nolan, Joanna Hogg, well, we can scrap that because the Tenet reshoots went on a bit too long, but could have worked with Joanna Hogg, Claire Denis, Robert Eggers, Brandy Corbett, David Cronenberg, James Gray, and became one of A24's most prolific actors. Isn't good enough for Batman, according to Chad from Arkansas. So poor Chad, a bit of a straw man there. But I mean, that was kind of true of the kind of backlash. And
but I mean, it's probably true of every actor who's potentially taken on the role of Batman. I know that people were probably against Ben Affleck. I mean, people were certainly against Michael Keaton when he took on the role. I think Christian Bale was maybe a bit, but I mean, even like Heath Ledger with the Joker. Every time someone's casting a Batman movie, some people don't like it. But I know what you're saying about the leaving Twilight behind. Obviously, you know, it probably wasn't his favorite experience. You know, he was just sort of starting off as an actor, but I think even in some of his audio commentaries on the films, he's a bit down on some of the parts of the process. So it was a surprise for him to come back to something like this. I mean, Tenet was, you know, you get to work with Christopher Nolan, but this, which is potentially a larger commitment, you know, a franchise, you know, apparently, you know, originally it was a one and done. That may or may not be, you know, changing as we move forward, depending on how successful it is. But you know, he would have known what he was signing back up for. So I guess, you know, the odds were good that he saw something certainly in the script, in Matt Reeves' vision, that would have allowed him to come back onto this kind of movie making train. And I think the only other thing which was a bit confusing in my eyes was the rather, I mean, yeah, this was 2019, it was announced, the rather erratic, you know, DCEU, Detective Comics Extended Universe, where it was like, what are they going with? You know, they had this plan, and then, you know, Justice League wasn't really going as what it was, so then they had another Joker movie, which was a standalone, and now then they were bringing in another Batman, and it's like, you know, where does this all tie into the overarching structure? Nobody really knows. I don't think at this stage. So that was another question mark. But yeah, I think it's safe to say that this version is certainly a world away from the current Justice League version of Batman and his surrounding characters.
Yeah, so let's dive into the film. So, when the Riddler, a sadistic serial killer, begins murdering key political figures in Gotham, Batman is forced to investigate the city's hidden corruption and question his family's involvement. So, we kind of talked about our feelings going into the movie. What was your reaction yesterday? We watched it at 9 a.m. in the morning. We were finished for about lunchtime. And I think I turned to you before the film started going, I'm really not sure where I mentally am kind of going into this movie, because sometimes you go into a film and, you know, it might have done the festival circuits, you know, there's a bit of buzz, you know, hype going around. You might have seen some initial reviews from your Varieties, Empires, etc. But, you know, this film was sort of embargoed until 5 p.m. UK time yesterday. So there wasn't even a hint of, is this going to be a good film or a bad film? I think you'd heard some indications it was a quote-unquote interesting movies, but how did you feel when you came out of the film at lunchtime yesterday?
Yeah, I mean, I was going into it having worked a 7-day week, 56 hours, so thankfully I'd taken the bus down the night before and stayed in a hotel, so I got at least a decent night's sleep, because I knew that this film was nearly 3 hours long. It's on first thing. You know, if I'd got the bus down in the morning, there would have been potential for me to potentially fall asleep, which would have been no criticism of the film whatsoever. It would have been where I was at. So yeah, like you say, the London press screening was Thursday, and you know, they had the embargo, which was not only a review embargo but a social embargo, and from what I could see, nobody broke it. So, you know, well done, well, fair play to everyone there. All I got though was basically lots of people basically saying that they'd seen the Batman and their thoughts. They had lots to discuss. They had lots of thoughts, and their thoughts would go live at 5 p.m. on Monday. Everyone kept talking about 5 p.m. Monday. I'm not sure if it was something that, if that multimedia screening embargo said that if you are tweeting about the Batman, you must tweet that you're going to share your views at 5 p.m. on Monday. But the fact that they said they had thoughts and stuff like that was potentially leaning towards either, oh, is it not very good, or potentially it's maybe more divisive, a Batman film. Perhaps it goes down angles that not everyone agrees with. Maybe there's a new take on the character. So I was interested to see where it was going to go. But I mean, it's certainly a bold start for a film, but we can talk about the start. I think it basically starts with a point of view shot of, with some heavy breathing of the Riddler looking at his victim, set to the tune of Ava Maria, which is not really something you would expect from a Batman movie. But after the initial kill, we get this sort of Travis Bickle taxi driver voiceover of Bruce Wayne sort of talking about how he's becoming the Batman. I think this is basically set in year 2. Not Batman year 2, but basically I think he's in his diaries, he calls it the Gotham Project. So it's year 2. He's just finding his feet. He's already working with Jim Gordon. Jim Gordon's got the bat signal up and stuff like that, and it's not just a call, it's a warning. And between Greg Fraser's cinematography, this is the guy who did the cinematography on June, Michael Giacchino's score, Matt Reeves' direction, and Robert Pattinson's performance, the opening salvo where we are introduced to this version of the Batman for the first time is hands down easily the best introduction for the character since Keaton in 1989, I think. What about yourself?
Yeah, I came out a little bit mixed. I think I 100% agree. We can talk about the opening hour, as it were. I thought the opening hour was up there with some of the best Batman stuff I'd ever seen. But I think it's interesting where the one thing I will never argue about this film is not well cast. I think each and every role is fantastic. But for a film that's nearly sort of 3 hours long, there's a lot of things I've sort of seen before, or plays on things I've seen before in many Batman movies, and many of them within sort of the past sort of 15 years in films that people have watched multiple times, and that just felt all too familiar. And there was certain elements that I really liked but didn't feel there was enough of, and I think that's pretty inexcusable for sort of a 3 hour movie. And I don't mean that necessarily in a harsh way, it's just that's my main criticism of the movie, and sort of handicaps it to an extent. The one thing I've been desperate for a long time, and I'm really glad this film has leaned into it, because it's been really underserved in nearly all of the Batman movies, is Detective Batman. And immediately we're sort of drawn into that world. I mean, I think they were kind of very much alluding to it before the film came out. You don't want to be watching this film and thinking, oh, we're going to be comparing it to previous Batman movies or superhero movies. We want you to think of Seven, Zodiac, these type of David Fincher serial killer movies. And it really leans into that for sort of the first hour, and then it becomes really quite broad, sort of this kind of political kind of drama, and then sort of a by and large kind of conventional kind of superhero movie, but it was just hard not to feel like there'd been a lot of sort of search and replace had gone on, or whether we've just hit saturation of kind of the Batman character for now. And I mean, when you think of all the movies we've had since kind of the mid 2000s, Batman Begins, then The Dark Knight, then The Dark Knight Rises, and as you say, the Lego Batman movies, which can be quite derivative of these things, and then Batman v Superman, then the Justice League, and Batman popping up and other things. I mean, one of the bits that should have been the real highlight of the film in terms of bringing the Riddler and Batman together, I was sitting there thinking, going, I'm pretty sure I've watched this exact scene, and obviously it's frustrating, and it's not necessarily the film's fault, a great scene, but I'm like, I watched this scene in the Dark Knight almost semi beat for beat, and it just sort of starts to kind of frustrate you a little bit. That as much as I enjoyed the film, ultimately it didn't need to exist, and that was something I didn't expect to feel come the end of the movie.
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly, I think from in the final act, once the Riddler's master plan is revealed, um, I mean, there's the bits of it in the trailer where they, like you say, they have this face to face set in a prison, which is, like you say, reminiscent of the scene with the Joker and Batman and the Dark Knight, but also other movies, say, like a couple of Bond ones where Bond is talking to Blofeld or Silva, and it realizes that part of their plan was that they had to get caught and stuff like that. And I think I remembered yesterday on the train home that I think it was the Star Trek Into Darkness also has a similar plot point in it. And I think we need to definitely sort of call an amnesty on that sort of plot point being used in a thing. But I think, yeah, like you say, the first sort of 2/3 for me are the film where it is at its strongest, where we see, Batman living up to his moniker of in the, he debuted in Detective Comics, and he's often called the world's greatest detective, and this is the first time probably since one would potentially argue Adam West's Batman in the Batman series. He had loads of like gadgets and devices and stuff to help him solve crimes and stuff like that in the 60s. So I think it's probably the first time since then. And like you say, the first trailer when it dropped, it was like, you would see a lot of people on Twitter definitely getting a lot of Fincher vibes here, a lot of Seven, a lot of Zodiac and stuff like that. I mean, I tweeted when Paul Dano was cast as the Riddler, obviously a world away from the likes of Frank Gorsh and Jim Carrey, and I was like, I would love to see a really sort of sadistic version of the Riddler who is basically going around killing people and leaving clues, and Batman has to solve them, in order to save the next victim and stuff like that. And that's what I got. So I was very, very happy. I mean, not only with like Seven and Zodiac, but also some elements, I would say, leaning towards the Saw movies as well. There's certain sort of traps and the way that certain people are dispatched would lean into that. So a lot of modern references and stuff. And I mean, Matt Reeves himself has talked about, even specifically with the Riddler's costume, it's very Zodiac-esque. And it's interesting to see that, times have changed, whereas the Zodiac, in order to get his message out, was sending letters to the newspapers and stuff like that. And so the Riddler's now using video calls and social media and sort of posting on incel Reddit forums and stuff like that. So, it's been updated that way. And yeah, I think, like you say, the rest of the cast as well, Riddler is definitely going down the sort of Zodiac vibe, but I would say the characters like the Penguin and Catwoman definitely sort of fit into the sort of film noir sort of canon, I would say, because certainly with I know that a lot of people are probably not going to enjoy it. I personally would have liked to have seen more of it, and that was of the sort of hard-boiled detective narration that sort of topped and tailed the film. I would have maybe liked to see a bit more of like the internal thinking of Batman, but narration is a very difficult tightrope to walk in movies. Sometimes it's just too much, and it's, as I think Brian Cox's Robert McKean adaptation said, it's just sloppy, lazy writing sometimes. But when it's done well, it's really good. And yeah, there's definitely that sort of 40s sort of style of Gotham. It's certainly like that opening scene where it sort of goes around this sort of Times Square-esque area of Gotham. It just sort of screams a sort of taxi driver and stuff like that. Again, Travis Bickle had his diaries and stuff like that as well. So all that kind of stuff I loved. I think, yeah, for me, once the final act happens and the plan is revealed, that's where it tends to go down a slightly more conventional route where you have everyone together and you've got to save the day and stuff, and it's where Batman moves away from being a detective and into this sort of superhero aspect, even though one could always argue that Batman is not a superhero. He has no superpowers except his keen intellect and his vast wealth. So but yeah, that's where it kind of let down for me, which is why I sort of decided eventually on a 4. I think it was a fantastic movie. Slightly didn't nail the superhero landing on one knee that so many others do, but I think there's a huge amount of potential, and I would like to see this world explored more. I think the other thing which we could maybe talk about is it does seem to set up the next movie And I was like, well, they could have maybe just left that aside, and it wasn't necessary. We know that there's going to be other characters out there. We didn't need to explicitly have this, Marvel cinematic universe. Fair enough. It wasn't in a post-credits thing. Although actually, I have to say, I forgot to tell you this, but after the screening, there was a post-credit scene, but it was basically just a trailer for the other upcoming DC movies this year. So it was like a very brief look at like Aquaman and stuff like that. But there was a link to advertise the Riddler's website, which you can go on and play some games if you so wish to.
It sounds like I didn't miss too much when I went for a big pee during the post credits. I think it's interesting we talk about the first hour, which I thought was excellent. I think that one really blends all the characters together really well. It feels really tight. It's pushing forward this sort of like detective noir kind of movie. The voiceovers, etc. It feels like we get plenty of Batman, Jim Gordon, Oswald. We have sort of Catwoman. We have the Riddler sort of in the background, but it feels like it's building. It feels like in the middle stretch of that movie, that all gets kind of jettisoned to a large extent. That this dynamic that we sort of see with Catwoman that's become quite interesting just vanishes. The Riddler almost goes away from the picture altogether. Apart from one really exciting kind of chase scene, sort of the Penguin kind of vanishes as well. It just sort of feels like it, that middle section, and we introduce sort of like, kind of Falcone and these other kind of characters come into the mix. And, it's one of those ones I remember just feeling really on a high in that first hour, and then just sort of like the middle, it just really starts to feel like it stutters. And I think you said it, really well yesterday. It feels like there's two scripts kind of for this film, and you can kind of see what was potentially a really strong script in the first one, and then in the second one it kind of lost me as a sort of audience member. And if I was to be asked about sort of what happened in that whole sort of second hour, my mind's at a blank, and I sort of watched that kind of yesterday. It's a lot of sort of family politics and sort of diving into potentially what the Riddler's trying to expose, which ultimately isn't that necessarily interesting, and in the grand scheme of things it doesn't warrant sort of a 3-hour runtime to expose something like this. There's a really good just over 2-hour version of this film, I think, in there.
I mean, there's a film like say like Blade Runner 2049, which I could have happily sat through 5 hours of. It was about 3 hours, but I could have easily sat through 5. I think it does. This one does. I mean, I never looked at my watch, but you do kind of feel that there is a lot of sort of world building, and like you say, there's a couple of scenes towards the end which sort of set up potential future installments. I think certainly by the reviews and the advanced box office sales, it's safe to say that this version of Batman is going to do very well, and they will probably look to do a sequel. Matt Reeves, I think, has hinted at the fact that he has got ideas, but of course, you're always going to say that. You're not going to shoot yourself in the foot and say that you don't want to continue on a successful franchise and get a nice payday if you can. But yeah, I think there's some stuff could have been trimmed in order to just sort of really sort of tighten it up. But I mean, it could have been even longer. Let's face it, But this is it's pretty much one of the first Batman film in a long time where, spoilers, I'm sorry to say this, but this may potentially put people on to seeing the film. It does not open with the death of Bruce Wayne's parents. It is only alluded to in a news report. We don't actually get to see that. And I mean, what did you think of this rather bold filmmaking technique to not bore people to death with what happened to Bruce's parents?
I'm glad I didn't get exposed to sort of those pearls just dropping in slow motion. I mean, as much as I talk about the film, kind of it feels very familiar in scenes and beats and comments. That one I was glad to see the back of. And I mean, I remember just sort of the whole backlash, I think, when, well, backlash as if there was any sort of a thing other than that to Batman v Superman, of like, oh my god, we're opening with this same old story that we've seen a million times. And you saw that with the recent Spider-Man series, where they were like, we don't need to see Uncle Ben killed for the first time. I think what they did with the Waynes was interesting. It perhaps didn't need to be a huge focus as it became. I think that became to the detriment of the movie and so on. But I thought that was kind of, it was a wise decision. And but there was ultimately too many things, and something that you've just kind of alluded to as well. Like, there was just like something towards the end of the movie where you were just like, for God's sake, do we really need to do this now? It's one of those things. What might have felt like a huge shock and surprise at the end of certain movies or moments or revelations. We're like, oh, we're doing this one again because of course we've got to do that. As much as the film does a lot of new and interesting things, ultimately it's handicapped by the all too familiar.
Yeah, no, that one particular scene, it's like that feels more like a reaction to the Marvel Cinematic Universe than anything else it does. It does such a good job of trying to set out its stall, and it's this is its own unique version of the Batman, but it just strays too close to, well, we still have to hit certain things in order to leave the potential open for franchise. I'm just thinking back to, apropos of nothing, The Dark Knight and no, actually, Batman Begins. Sorry, not The Dark Knight. Batman Begins, which was the first one in Nolan's one. That was 2005. So that was before Iron Man, and you had the introduction of all these. Iron Man obviously was not the first film to ever do a post credits thing, but it was certainly the first one to lay out its stall of, well, we're setting something up for the next one. Which is, for me, Marvel's biggest sin at the moment, which was, I mean, we saw it with the Doctor Strange trailer that came out, and it's like, no one's talking about Doctor Strange or anything that he's doing. It's all about, oh my gosh, was that Patrick Stewart? Are the X-Men finally anything? It's like every film, the discourse is all about what happened at the end and how it sets up the next one. It basically removes any discussion or critique of the film itself. And that, for me, is, I mean, I still watch all the Marvel films. I will enjoy them, but it just feels to me like they're becoming a victim of their own success, right? But before Iron Man came out in 2008, Batman Begins was 2005, and it was like, well, we have no idea how this is going to do. The last Batman film before this was Batman and Robin in 1998. It was a critical disaster, and it made some money, but it certainly at one point was looking like it was going to have killed off the comic book movie. So, Nolan, he gets to do his thing, and at the end he just puts just a little tiny teaser, and it's just like this guy is running around in clown makeup, and just turns over and it's a Joker playing card, and everyone goes, oh my gosh, wow, we might get the Joker at some point. But it wasn't really like a big thing. It was a nice thing, but it didn't, it wasn't explicit in what it set up. This film kind of goes against that, and yeah, it would have been better for it. Obviously, we don't want to go into any spoilers about anything like that, but what did you make of watching the film in a certain city, and then the end scene being filmed in that city, and then being able to walk out the screen and basically see that place from the top floor of the cinema?
It's pretty cool, isn't it? Like, you take a lot of I've taken a lot of pride, whether it's a silly movie like a Fast and the Furious,
John Cena's zipline.
Yeah, or movies like this, or with the Avengers. Like, it's hard not to take a bit of pride when you see your city, or country represented in big screen movies that people are seeing all around the world. Like, you have that almost thing where you just want to, if you were watching it with someone from Chicago or Australia, just nudge you going, I just live around the corner from there, or do you know, I go to work meetings just near there. I find things like that are really good. I mean, we've got a brilliant independent film scene in Scotland and so on, but it's always these films that just get out wide, and it's we passed by and they were getting ready to film sort of Batgirl or whatever it was in sort of George Square yesterday, and it's one of those things, is as much as you take a bit of pride in seeing your country represented in these huge blockbusters, it's always the local talent, whether it's the the gaffers or the producers, the kind of backstage producers, etc., the craftspeople, being able to do that, or people even sort of boosting the local economy. That's always a great thing. And I'm really proud that we're this reputation is continuing to grow and grow for us.
It's just a shame that Glasgow, Edinburgh in Avengers Infinity War, Edinburgh was Edinburgh. In Fast and Furious, Edinburgh was Edinburgh. Glasgow, while it gets probably more films filmed there, it always seems to be playing something else, whether that's Gotham or London or something like that. So one day, Glasgow can be Glasgow, hopefully, in a big Hollywood feature film. And Aberdeen, we got Tetris a couple of years ago, so still waiting on that to come out, and seeing Aberdeen as Soviet Russia in the 80s. So of course, given everything that's going on, maybe that'll be delayed, who knows. But it's great to see that, and the fact that they've gone now from filming a couple of scenes of the Batman in Glasgow to filming the entire Batgirl movie in Glasgow. J.K. Simmons has been spotted around. Michael Keaton's popped up in a couple of Italian restaurants, although was not in Paisano yesterday when we were getting our post-Batman. Shame, but maybe next week when we're down and we're going to try and gate crash the filming, and I think we could pass off as Gotham City residents.
I don't think it's a perfect movie. I think we've definitely got a mixed reaction to it, but I think my big hope, that we're going to get a sequel and so on. It'll be a matter of time before it gets announced, but my feeling is, give it 5 years. That's a big ask in this world, but give it 5 years. I think we need a break from the Batman. He's my favorite comic book character. He's the one that I will always go see opening weekend or day, best I can. But I'm just I think it's time for a little bit of a break, and hopefully absence gives people time to think of unique and different ways, and even the villain plots. I mean, this one it apes a lot of things that we saw exactly in the Dark Knight. You certainly see instead of like Arkham people kind of doing things, it's sort of incels doing things, scenes at funerals and events and stuff like that. It's kind of, there's so much of it's been done, so I think there's a break is very much needed, and I think hopefully the audience and everyone will appreciate that. But I suspect we'll be back here again in maybe 2.5 years talking about it.
Well, technically we could be talking about Batman in about 7 months, as Michael Keaton returns to the role in Flashpoint, and then the Batgirl movie, which will probably be out next year. But I think we will get another installment of sad emo Bats, with our Bats in it. Although hopefully, like you say, they wait a couple of years to do it, because I don't want it to interfere with him still, filming stuff for A24. Hopefully he will do at least a one for them, one for me sort of deal, where he still sort of goes for the quirky, dangerous indie projects, as well as getting paying off his mortgage or getting a new kitchen with every new Batman film.
Well, I'm going to go one step further. I hope it's 1 for them and 5 for him. I want to see him back to his horny, cum-ridden self in
well,
movies.
There was a point, given all this stuff, recently, where people got upset that Batman and Catwoman were shagging on top of a building and stuff. And I was like, given, Batman's path, Robert Pattinson's frequency for self-pleasure and thing, and certainly Michael Giacchino's score is probably the sexiest Batman has been since Batman Returns, last with Catwoman. I guess, what was it you said? Fully expecting the Alison Janney meme from I, Tonya, where it's just like, you two do it yet? I thought there was a point where, are they going to have sex on top of this building? I don't know. I mean, it was rated a 15, so it was going slightly edgier than previous versions.
Yeah, so we'll be back. Hopefully, we'll be back obviously before 2.5 years' time to discuss plenty of movies. But we'll be back in 2 weeks to discuss something maybe new, something original, or something borrowed. Thanks very much for listening, and be sure to tune into our A24 podcast episode that will be out on Friday, as we dive into the counter programming movie to the Batman, which will also star Colin Farrell. So be sure to check out our After Yank review. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Join the revolution. Join the Nerd Party.
Welcome to Nerd Party.